Bye.
Thanks. Good evening, everyone. We are just about to start. Thanks very much for joining us, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this online book launch on behalf of Wits University Press and the History Workshop. Guerrilla radios in Southern Africa, broadcasters, technology, propaganda, war, and the armed struggle is edited by Sekibakiba Lekgoathi, Tsepo Moloi, Alda Romao Saute Saide, and it's published by Wits University Press. The book was produced with the support of the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences, and it's on sale at bookstores in South Africa, including Clark's and Exclusives, and you can also buy a copy from online retailers, both in South Africa and through Amazon.com. The book, the chapters in the book look at various aspects of the history of radios that were attached to liberation movements in Southern Africa, in Angola, in Mozambique, in Namibia, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe. And in many ways, it's a really path-breaking collection in terms of the new research that it brings out, and a really important contribution to both the scholarship on radio in Africa and on liberation struggles in the region. So I must congratulate the editors and all the contributors on a really excellent volume. And I hope that everyone here will get themselves a copy. So our speakers tonight are Sekiba Lekgoathi, who is both one of the editors and authors in the book, and he's joined by Lloyd Hazvineyi, who is one of the contributors, and we are hoping that Ali Hlongwane, another contributor, will be joining us for the discussion, but he's just having some struggling to connect in between internet issues and load shedding here. And we are very pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Stephen Davies, who's going to offer some initial responses and comments. And after that, oh, here is Ali. After that, we'll open it up to the audience for some questions that you can put in the chat or put your hand up, and I'll call you out to unmute yourself. I'm going to introduce the speakers as they speak. So I'm going to start with Sekiba. Here's the book, by the way. I want to pin Sekiba on the screen. So Sekiba Lekgoathi is associate professor at Wits University. He's published widely on Ndebele ethnicity, on public radio in African languages in South Africa, on the ANC's radio freedom, the politics of knowledge production, as well as on popular protests in rural and urban South Africa. He's currently completing a monograph titled The Politics of Ndebele Ethnicity in South Africa. He's also contributed to history textbooks and has been involved with a history workshop in facilitating oral history workshop for educators and learners across the country. He's also serving as a member of the ministerial task team on history for the Department of Basic Education. Over to you, Sekiba. Sekiba, as an editor and author, will speak a bit longer than the rest of the speakers. So I'm going to give you about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll move on to the other speakers. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for those introductions, and good evening, everyone. So this book was originally published by Roman and Littlefield International. And the Wits Press edition of the book, which Ariana has just shown us here, which has been launched this evening is therefore by arrangement with Roman and Littlefield International. So this book comes out of robust conversations in the 2 workshops held at WITS and at Pedagogic University in Maputo in February and November 2017, respectively. So those conversations actually crystallized into this book that we are launching here tonight. Now, in 2016, I, as project leader, took the initiative of submitting an application for funding to the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. They had a project called the Atalytic Research Project. And I, together with my friend and colleague, who's unfortunately not here with us tonight, that is Tsepo Moloi, another a co-editor, and 2 Mozambican colleagues, historians, Alda Romao Sautesaide and Elosio Viegas Felipe. We coordinated the workshops and saw to the successful execution of this initiative. We are indeed grateful for the generous financial support for the Liberation War Radios project received from the NIHSS. Now, these workshops attracted like-minded researchers and scholars, based mostly at universities in Southern Africa. Only 3 scholars in the whole team are actually based in Northern universities. So the majority of the scholars are based in the South. Now, the one thing we all had in common was that our projects explored the role that guerrilla radios played in the liberation struggles in the Southern African region. Now, this book would not have materialized had it not been for the passion, the commitment, and hard work of the contributors to the 2 workshops in 2017. Now, why this book? The book project arose out of the realization that there was a gap in the historiography on the media of the liberation movements in Africa, especially on radio. Now, despite the explosion of research on liberation struggles in Southern Africa, and the proliferation of memoirs, biographies, autobiographies on prominent leaders of the movements, as well as a scattering of autobiographies and biographies of the foot soldiers of the liberation movements, there remained a dearth of studies on the media that the liberation movements employed, more especially on radio. So in 1994, of course, Lebona Mosia, Charles Riddle, and Jim Zafiro published an exploratory article that made a comparative analysis of 4 liberation war radios in Southern Africa. Now, clearly, this was a very small, exploratory radio, and their conclusions regarding their actual impact, the actual impact of these radios was rather indeterminate. They didn't even go into issues of listenership. But then, this small piece was, in fact, a small spark that set the house on fire, that ultimately led to this co-edited book. Now, guerrilla radios served as a source of alternative information and counter-propaganda, spending a considerable amount of time dispelling the messages propagated through the media of the white minority regimes. They also served the most critical role of recruiting freedom fighters for the liberation movements in exile. By looking at case studies of guerrilla radios from the region, the project sought to contribute towards advancing regional scholarship on the histories of these radios and their contestation of the colonial or apartheid state's monopoly of the airwaves. It is about transcending the limitation of the parochial approach of simply looking at guerrilla radios within the nation state, finding connections and situating them within the context of a common struggle against white minority rule and class and racial oppression in the region. Now, since the 1950s, radio has been the predominant medium of mass communication in Africa. Not only was radio broadcasting employed by the colonial states in the service of empire, but the liberation forces also appropriated it as a weapon in the struggle for independence. With the turn to the armed struggle and movement into exile in the early 60s, access to radio station became a top priority for the nationalist movements in Southern Africa. Through radio, the guerrilla movement sought to maintain a sonic presence among their supporters at home. It was a means through which they could shape their supporters' political views and behavior, and more especially their activities in resisting white rule. The liberation movements also, of course, used other media, particularly print, but radio clearly occupied a special place in the struggle for independence, which is why all these radios that we look at in the region actually had a radio station in exile. Now, sound had the most appeal. It was also direct. It appealed specifically to the individual. It was almost speaking to the individual. Now, through radio, the national liberation movements could address their supporters instantly and directly behind enemy lines. They didn't need to be in Zimbabwe or South Africa or Namibia to address their audiences. Behind enemy lines, they could address their audiences. They could maintain their presence at home without being physically present at home. The appropriation of radio by the nationalist movements, nevertheless, caused severe nervousness and anxiety on the part of the white minority regimes in the region, who were unwilling to surrender their monopoly over the airwaves. Now, this nervousness prompted the colonial regimes to listen, or rather to listen in, to closely monitor and jam these subversive radios in order to cut off listenership and to clamp down on the potential for rebellion. The concept of the nervousness of the state came into this book via Mose Chigowero's work. Mose is one of the contributors of an essay in this book, who in turn coined the concept of nervousness from Nancy Rose Hunt's work on the condition of the Belgian colonial state in the Congo. Now, Marisa Moorman, who's also another contributor on Angola, shows in her contribution in this volume that the Portuguese colonial authorities listened into the guerrilla radios and subscribed, or rather transcribed the broadcast messages and arrested and prosecuted anyone caught listening. This, of course, happened in the whole of Southern Africa, as other chapters actually demonstrate. Now, what is the history of radio in Africa? Now, in terms of its conceptualization, radio first came to Africa as a tool of empire. It symbolized a European presence, and radio became a critical tool of modern technology for achieving the ambitions of those who were determined to govern the Black population by domination rather than consent. It was in the interest of those in power to control and contain Africa, or rather African access to radio. And when African nationalist movements flipped the script and adopted radio as a means for contesting colonial domination and attaining liberation, a protracted warfare of the airwaves ensued. This war of the airwaves is explored in Sifiso Ndlovu's chapter on contestation between Radio South Africa and Radio Freedom. Now, radio played an inimitable role in the liberation struggle in Southern Africa, particularly after the turn to the armed struggle. It became a tool for pushing the liberation struggle propaganda and galvanizing opposition against white minority rule. Yet no substantial work has actually been done, has been conducted that has made an effort to situate guerrilla radios within the broader regional context, apart from some cursory hints in the voluminous body of essays, memoirs, biographies, and other autobiographies elsewhere. Now, most of the work produced so far, and what makes this book such a major contribution to scholarship, is that they tend to be parochial. These works that exist tend to be parochial. even though they look at radio, they tend to be parochial in the sense that they look at specific colonial territories or specific countries. They tend to be parochial in that sense, analyzing each radio within the framework of the nation state. Now, before our book, there had been very little sustained research to provide historical and social analysis of the use of sound in the liberation struggle. Okay, in the liberation struggle specifically. Of course, we recognize that our work actually forms part of a broader body of work on radio much more generally. And some of us in this project have contributed to that work, as Ariane actually showed in the introduction. So we know very little about how the nationalist movements were able to engage in a war of the airwaves against the white minority regimes, or to capture the hearts and minds of the people from their bases in exile. We know even less about content production and reception of the messages broadcast on this radio station. I'm checking my time, and I still have time, right, Rihanna? About 5 minutes or so?
5 minutes.
Okay, sure, good. Okay, we'll try. So then this book, as I've already indicated, is a collection of essays on the histories of these radios, the radios of the liberation movements in the region. It is about the experiences of the broadcasters as well. So some of the chapters look at the experiences of the broadcasters. Who were these broadcasters? And listeners as well. So we ask questions about listenership. We ask questions about listenership, not just the supporters of the liberation movements, but also the opponents of those liberation struggle during the era of the armed struggle. Now, using archival sources such as sound recordings of the guerrilla radios and the written records of the colonial state about these illegal and underground radios and listenership to them, together with interviews conducted by the contributors with former broadcasters and listeners, the essays contained in this volume ask complex questions about the social histories of these stations. They explore issues of listenership and listening cultures, the way that people listened to these radios. I think it's fascinating how people actually used to listen to these radios, and also what they did with what they heard on radio, the kind of messages that they got from these radios, and how those messages actually influenced the struggles, if at all. Those are some of the questions that we explore. Some of the chapters look at, I think I shouldn't say some of the chapters, my chapter in particular looks at the support that the liberation movement sought from international solidarity organizations. It looks at how Africa itself contributed to the liberation struggle in Southern Africa. So those are some of the chapters. And of course, the book is divided into various regions. The Portuguese colonies, Zimbabwe, in the middle, there is a solitary chapter on Namibia. And then there are 3 chapters that look at various aspects on South Africa. And most importantly, the last chapter of the book does what no other book has actually done before, and that is to look at the radio of the PAC. And Ali Hlongwane is here, he will talk about that. But it's very fascinating. Who knew that the PAC also had its own radio? And so Ali will actually talk to that in a minute. Now, so the essays also examine the relationship that these radios forged at their multiple sites of operation in host countries, as well as looking at international solidarity and support, specifically for radio broadcasting initiatives. Now, in the end, we believe that this book pushes the frontiers of knowledge production beyond exploration of broadcast content toward a more nuanced conception of radio as a medium formed by social and political processes. Guerrilla radio broadcasting, we argue, became a very powerful technology for disseminating insurgent propaganda messages of the liberation movement and for mobilizing African workers, peasants, students, youth in the struggle against white minority domination in the entire region. I hope that gives you a sense of what this book is about. And I'll now step back and thank you, Ariana, for allowing me to speak, but there are two other speakers, in fact, three other speakers, of course, including the discussant. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sekiba, for that overview and introduction of the book. Ali, we are very happy that you've been able to join us. Let's see if we can hear you as well, but I need to introduce you first. Ali Khangela Hlongwane has a PhD in Heritage Studies from Wits University, and he's a researcher at the Wits History Workshop. He's published on aspects of the public histories of the June 76 uprising, and his recent books include the co-authored Public History and Culture in South Africa, written with Sifiso Ndlovu, who is another contributor to the book we are launching tonight. And he's also just published his biography of Zephaniah Motoping, The Lion of Azania, which has been published by Scotterville. He is the author of a chapter on the PAC's voice of the PAC, which, as Sekiba just mentioned, is the first kind of published research on the PAC's radio broadcasting. Ali, you have about 10 minutes to speak about your contribution to the book. I hope it's going to work out. Thank you. I think we can hear you now, Ali. And it's fine, you can leave a video of...
You can hear me now?
Improve.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. In a very difficult situation, my contribution in the book, as indicated by the editor, Sekibakiba, and also Ariana, in introducing me, focuses on the PAC. The chapter itself is titled "In Search of PAC Footprints in Broadcasting."
We lost your audio, Ali. We lost your audio. You're muted. There you go.
Okay. Yes, I was saying the chapter is called "In Search of PAC Footprints in Broadcasting," largely because the chapter is really exploratory. It's the initial phase of a study of the PAC's use of radio. It looks at the history of broadcasting in the PAC from the time of its early days in exile. The members were first located in Ghana and were associated with the Bureau of African Nationalism, which was established by Kwame Nkrumah after Ghana's independence in 1957 as a vehicle to give support to liberation movements. And the PAC did not have a radio station of its own, but it was given a slot within Ghana's radio broadcasts. And they, according to the people who were involved, one of them is Peter Mlutsi, He makes, of course, claims that the broadcasts reached even South Africa itself, and they had to struggle with the system blocking those transmissions. I have not yet been able to verify that claim and statement, and the PAC itself does contradict the statement. According to Vuyisile Dhlovu, he says the PAC's interest in broadcasting was to talk to the people in host countries, conscientize them about why they were exiled, fighting the apartheid regime from the
Bra Ali, we've lost your audio again. Please unmute. Bra Ali?
had established a platform that was nearly similar to what Nkrumah had established as the Bureau of African Nationalism, a center for liberation struggles, particularly from Southern Africa. And after that short period, there was an attempt to establish a radio station in the Congo. But that initiative was really not a PAC initiative. It was a initiative of the PAC. Established or attempted to establish broadcasting in the Congo. There was already contradictions within the organization, but also independent African countries were no longer at ease with the Congo as Lumumba had just been killed and Chombe had taken over. Of course, the longest period of the broadcast is in Tanzania, within the infrastructure of the radio program of the government of Tanzania. The PAC was given slots about 3 times a week, excuse me, but they were not the only ones. They were side by side with SWAPO and also side by side with the ANC. What has been interesting with this study is that one has been able to locate quite a substantial chunk of archives. In the published article, most of the archives used are the scripts that were deposited at the University of Fort Hare in the Liberation Archives there at Nahes. Most of them are handwritten, a few typed, very interesting corrections being made on the scripts, which gives you a sense of what the themes were. And the broadcasters, of course, say they drew a lot from South African newspapers like Rand Daily Mail, Citizen, but gave them their own slant and interpretation to articulate the PAC's perspective on the issues. They also draw from the international media, like develop their own script. The method, of course, begins with freedom songs, and then the broadcaster would introduce the program in the listeners of the theme of that particular day. The themes ranged from what the PAC understood as a national and social question and its interpretation of what that national and which traces of artists from Yohima Sikela to Miriam Makeba to grassroots cultural terms of what was the role of revolutionary culture from their point of view. They also interviewed the leaders of the PAC and individuals of the PAC who came to join the movement, some Robin of the party's propaganda to its listeners. In terms of the listeners themselves, the limitations of the study is that I have spoken just to a few cadres of the PAC who were in the camps. Of course, they did listen to the radio program. They also used it as a forum for their own political education. However, I have not as yet located anyone inside the country who would have listened to the PAC radio. And I must insert myself in this context that as a PAC activist, I never got to listen to the PAC radio when I was in the country. All we got as young activists were cassettes that were smuggled, particularly through Botswana, by activists like Jackie Siroke, who has just published his memoirs.
Thanks.
Therefore, yes, hello?
Thanks very much, Ali. No, I'm just asking you to wrap up.
Oh, okay. Therefore, there is still more interesting work that one would still like to pursue. Maybe as a closing remark, I should indicate that subsequent to the publication, I to go and let the state of the archives when I was there, also not accession is how to access them. And
Ali, we are losing you. Unfortunately, the connection is bad, but Ali, we are losing you. So I'm just going to, I think there was some disruption, but we got most of it. Thanks very much, Ali. I'm glad that you were able to join us in spite of the challenges. We are going to move on to our third speaker, who is Lloyd Hazvineyi. Let me introduce him to you. Lloyd is a doctoral fellow and assistant lecturer at Wits University. He's also a fellow at the Humanities Graduate Center at Wits and holds an MA in African history from the University of Zimbabwe. His PhD research explores the relationship between nature and humans in colonial Zimbabwe. And he has co-authored 2 of the chapters in Guerrilla Radios on ZAPU's Voice of the Revolution and ZANU's Voice of Zimbabwe. Over to you, Lloyd.
Thank you so much, Ariana. It's a pleasure to be on this platform. So I'm going to briefly highlight the major talking points for our 2 co-authored chapters, that is chapters 6 and 7. So basically, the 2 chapters are a culmination of work that was research that was conducted at the National Archives of Zimbabwe. So basically, information were radio transcripts that were produced by the Southern Rhodesian government from the 1960s up to around 1979. So the Southern Rhodesian Parliament, particularly the Department of Information, was responsible for listening to guerrilla broadcasts from both Zambia and Mozambique. So this also reveals a very important dynamic that the colonial government itself was part of the listening community. In addition to that, we also conducted oral interviews with former guerrilla broadcasters. In chapter 6, our starting point really was to understand the history of broadcasting in general in Southern Rhodesia. And we found out that the British Colonial Office, together with the Southern Rhodesian government,
Hi, Lloyd. Can you still hear us? Lloyd, we seem to have lost you.
Load shedding.
Hmm.
Probably.
It looks as if you're still in the meeting, but we can't hear you.
Hmm.
I think, should we move on to Stephen? And if Lloyd is able to rejoin, then we'll go back to him after Stephen. Yeah, I think we've lost him now. Sorry, Stephen, to put you on the spot, but let's just move on with you, and hopefully Lloyd is going to be able to rejoin the meeting. Please look out for him, Corina, in case he's in the waiting room of the meeting. A discussant tonight is Stephen Davis, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of Kentucky in the United States. He's written on the ANC's Radio Freedom, and he's the author of the ANC's War Against the State, Mkhonto weSizwe and the Liberation of South Africa, which was published by Indiana University Press in 2018. He's currently working on another book project on the 1981 Matola raid by apartheid security forces on the ANC in Mozambique. He is currently the principal investigator of a project called Bitter Aloe, which uses machine learning models to produce data visualizations from the TRC records, and their website is about to be formally launched, but in the meantime, researchers and the public can access the preliminary work at bitteraloeproject.com. I'm going to put it in the chat so that everybody can see it. Thanks a lot for joining us, and over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be invited to be a discussant for what is a work that makes multiple contributions to the historiography on radio, but I think more importantly, kind of charts a really important political praxis in between and within national spaces during decolonization in the Cold War. In my view, the contributors in this edited volume present arguments that engage with four central issues. Guerrilla radio is about shaping supporters at home, shaping their political views and behavior, and influencing the course of events there. Number two, guerrilla radio is not just about bridging gaps between the so-called exiles and inxiles, but it's also about managing the difficult conditions of dependency in exile, namely navigating the diplomatic concerns of host countries, as well as building international solidarity. Number three, guerrilla radio is also about establishing the legitimacy of exiled movements in a period of time where radio was important. This was when you couldn't be a viable movement without having a radio broadcasts. So these contributors in various ways are asking the question that, why did radio become essential? Its essential nature is often assumed, but in this book, it's interrogated. Fourth, contributors show how guerrilla radio fit within popular cultures of listening and speaking, as well as local ideas about the power of radio broadcasting. So I'd like to take these in some order with a few tangents here and there, and I'd like to highlight some of the strengths of the book. Radio broadcasting allowed exiled liberation movements to be present at home. That's something that's driven home by a number of contributors, that they could be present without being physically present. So these chapters call on us to interrogate this notion of sonic presence that guerrilla radio lent to liberation movements, especially among audiences already accustomed to listening to radio. These contributors ask us to consider what this new sonic presence meant to listeners, and how guerrilla radio presented itself as manifestly different from other broadcasts that listeners were already consuming. The authors also identify a common peculiarity. Despite the decidedly transnational nature of radio, scholarship on it remains squarely within the frame of the nation state. In this regard, this book is a long overdue attempt to draw connections across regions and between movements. However, there's a paradox here that relates to using liberation movement archives. Namely, how do we retell the history of guerrilla radio in transnational, regional, or thematic frames when the archives we use discipline us to think in national terms? Indeed, does it likewise make sense to look through radio through the lens of national liberation movements, or is another approach necessary? As some have begun to do here, should we reach beyond the liberation archives to find other sources that allow us to tell new stories? Many contributors test the presumption that exiled liberation movements intended to capture the hearts and minds of supporters through radio, while others demonstrated guerrilla radio's efficacy as a transmission belt of ideology. The tension is suggestive of a broader, unresolved problem in this literature, that of gauging audience size and the impact of broadcasts on listeners. Many authors rightly point out that the standard ways of measuring audience were simply impossible given the conditions in unliberated countries. These studies vary in their certainty about the dimensions of listenership, but some look elsewhere than the home country to discover new audiences in host countries that may have had more reliable listenership. In general, what I'm seeing here overall is a questioning of the assumption that the object of radio broadcasting is solely about capturing hearts and minds. Several authors implicitly question whether analytically repurposing this notion of hearts and minds, a concept drawn from counterinsurgency doctrine, is the best way to think through these problems. Again, as many contributors argue, radio was often used to establish and maintain legitimacy within communities of international solidarity, especially during those times when active insurgency was impossible. When the dimensions of audience is more certain, or are more certain, contributors move away from mechanistic understandings of message and reception. Several authors make the case that rather than persuasion and conscientization, radio may better be understood as establishing an oral and sonic presence among followers of liberation movements. In these contributions, the transmission of ideology isn't the most important part of broadcasting. Rather, it's the disruption of the symbolic mise-en-scène of colonial rule. In this regard, the verbatim content of radio may matter less than the simple act of intruding into a sonic space jealously guarded by the colonial state. As Dumasani Moyo and Chris Chinaka suggest, the medium, figuratively and in this case literally, may be the message. Marissa Moorman and Mose Chikawero also demonstrate this most effectively in their chapters on the psychic anxiety caused by radio, which intrinsically disrespects borders and the state that enforces them. Here, Nancy Rose Hunt's influence is most directly felt in the nervous condition of the colonial state, the anxiety about policing imposed borders of all kinds, both geographical and, in the sense of radio, the ethereal. This volume also demonstrates the importance of the relationship between radio and the archival traces it leaves. While radio in an electromagnetic sense is ephemeral, it nevertheless leaves legible marks in the written archive here and there, especially in the colonial archive. Again, Moorman calls attention to one enduring irony of the colonial, namely that its surveillance produced the most extensive archive of insurgency, but that archive was an archive of transcriptions, of copies of copies. Many contributors, following Benjamin's call to read against the grain, ask what, if anything, can be heard of the original voice when it is transcribed by a hostile listener. Having worked with American and British monitoring service records myself, I have to say that the performative aspects of broadcasting are absent there. However, as several contributors demonstrate, certain archives, such as the Portuguese monitoring services, have proven to be much richer in composition and detail, allowing us not only to peer through the glass darkly at the original content of broadcasts, but also learn much more about the official mind of the colonial state. Another issue related to the colonial state raised again and again are the heavy-handed efforts at censorship, namely jamming, which seems to be a very expensive investment that gives us an index for how nervous certain states were. An unanswered question, however, is how effective was jamming, both in a geographic and conceptual sense? There is a paradox in jamming that is common to all heavy-handed censorship. The very act of denial builds curiosity that might otherwise not be there. Making something illicit makes the act of listening into an outward expression of resistance. And it becomes a way to build community through transgressive complicity in illegal acts, as told in countless reminiscences, both oral and written. In turn, this raises the profile of guerrilla broadcasts. It is yet another example of the limits of colonial power in the way that the incoherence of the colonial state was self-defeating. The more sophisticated alternative to jamming was increasing the signal to noise ratio. And this was the concept behind counter-guerrilla radios, such as South Africa's Radio Bantu and the Portuguese colonial states, the Voice of Mozambique. One wonders if both guerrilla and counter-guerrilla broadcasts responded directly to one another, and what a close reading of such a dialogue might reveal. Likewise, as Sekibakiba, Lekgoathi, and others in this volume have pointed out, these counter-guerrilla radios opened their own spaces for subversion. Looking at Sifiso and Lovu's piece, one wonders if Radio South Africa, an external service that was sponsored by the South African state, similarly was a self-defeating project. More sophisticated listeners in the West could point to South African propaganda as proof that they were covering something up. Otherwise, why broadcast at all? This may have driven people to seek an alternative narrative or even support the ANC or other liberation movements. This volume addresses a major weakness in the literature on radio, which is the lack of focus on everyday life of broadcasters. Previously, there had been very little work on the relationship between host radios and between liberation radios in the region. Present throughout these studies are some of the first biographical sketches of broadcasters themselves. Guerrilla radio often presented itself as an anonymous, if not disembodied voice of the revolution, but several pieces here demonstrate how the experience of broadcasting fit within the life stories of individuals who both previously and subsequently did more than broadcasting. This biographical turn allows us to see broadcasting in a new register. In this regard, I think future work could interrogate the way radio figures in oral testimony and memoir, the two most important sources for biographical work. The sense I get is that the radio episode in life stories operates as a trope in narratives of personal discovery and political awakening. I wonder what Munyaradzi, Nyakudia, Lloyd Hazvineyi, Munyaradzi Mushonga's piece on Jane Ngwenya's work for Zapu's Voice of the Revolution might look like had they front-loaded the fact that she was also working on a written autobiography modeled on Joshua Nkomo and Nelson Mandela's autobiographies.
Stephen, we just lost your voice. Are you plugged in? Try to speak. We still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there you are.
Oh, excellent. Okay, great, wonderful.
We just lost you at Jane Ngwenya's writing her, placing a life story in the context of writing a memoir.
Yes, so she was, I wonder what that piece would look like had the authors foregrounded the fact that she was writing an autobiography modeled on Joshua Nkomo and Nelson Mandela's autobiographies. Since the archive on Guerrilla Radio is so fragmentary, it requires a sojourn into biography. But what these pieces suggest is that that sojourn comes with a need to apply new analytical tools to interrogate this material. Three pieces also focus on the diplomacy of exile and the varied forms of solidarity. Most prosaically, host states were generous with airtime in ways they couldn't be in material terms. Broadcasting was, relatively speaking, inexpensive and provided a very public demonstration of solidarity. However, removing access to state radio was a serious way of expressing disfavor with a group, of disciplining liberation movements that were half-jokingly seen as occupying armies in places like Zambia and Tanzania. Again, this connects to the issue of legitimacy in the literature on exile. A movement was only a real liberation movement in exile if you were on the air. Otherwise, you didn't exist. This gave host states an extraordinary amount of power over the politics of visibility. One could pick and choose whose voices to foreground. Robert Heinz's piece on the voice of Namibia demonstrates that international patrons such as the UN recognized this importance and devoted significant resources to ensure that SWAPO was an ever-present voice in the ether. Sekibakiba Lekgoathi notes that Dutch solidarity even contemplated bypassing state broadcasters by raising funds for the ANC's own high wattage transmitter and actually created mobile studios. I'd like to conclude with a general question about the operative term guerrilla radio. To my knowledge, guerrilla radio seems to be a recent neologism that is widely accepted by multiple authors here. But in my mind, having read this book, the term seems a bit too focused on armed struggle and not on the other spheres impacted by radio broadcasting. I'm thinking here of diplomacy and solidarity work, which runs through most of these pieces, but also cultural production. My question for the contributors is, should we revisit that term and evaluate it and maybe think about whether it's too restrictive for the broad range of purposes that radio is put to in this volume. I'd like to congratulate the contributors and editors of this volume. I think it's an absolutely superb contribution, and I've kind of not been an avid reader of histories of radio in Southern Africa for about 10 years now, and I was really pleasantly surprised to see how far this book has moved that literature forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your close reading of the book and your comments. I think that Lloyd, are you still there? He had been able to rejoin, but now I can't find him. How do I do this? Sorry, let me just.
I'm here, Rihanna.
Are you here? Please.
Yeah.
Please go ahead and unmute yourself. Lloyd also is experiencing some technical challenges, but I'm glad that you've been able to rejoin. Please go ahead, Lloyd.
Thank you so much, Ariana. I'm just going to switch off my video just to make the best of the connectivity. And my apologies for the glitch earlier. I was about to briefly discuss the history of radio broadcasting in Southern Rhodesia. And I had indicated that it was the British Colonial Office, together with the Southern Rhodesian government, who pushed for the idea of the introduction of radio in Southern Rhodesia, especially among the African communities. So we also tried to briefly compare the dynamics around the idea of radio for Africans. And there was a bit of reluctance on the part of the Southern Rhodesian government in terms of foreseeing the boomerang effects or the negative effects of radio amongst Africans. Unlike in South Africa, where there was actually a debate in parliament about the possibility of subversion by Africans. So in Southern Rhodesia, there was no debate in parliament. There was that uncritical approach towards radio technology amongst Africans. So that was around the 1940s when radio was introduced. So the Southern Rhodesian government introduced battery-powered radio sets, which were nicknamed the poor man's radio or the saucepan radio, because they were shaped like a saucepan. They had that funny round shape. The idea behind the colonial office push for the radio technology, especially in African communities, was part of the broad agenda to re-engineer or to engineer what other scholars have termed the native mind. So the infamous Native Affairs Department was very influential in terms of pushing for the Africans to adopt radio technology. So the ability to make sense, the ability to read, and the ability to listen to radio technology itself was used as one of the many yardsticks to measure Africans' ability to embrace modernization. So this is the brief background that we managed to come up with for our chapter 6. And in terms of understanding the history of ZAPU's Voice of the Revolution, the date 11 November 1965 is really, really important. For those that are familiar with the history of Southern Rhodesia, this is when Ian Smith's government introduced the Unilateral Declaration of Independence. And this declaration was followed by a state of emergency. So nationalist leaders were arrested and detained, and a few that escaped went into exile. So some of the people that went into exile on the ZAPU side included Jane Ngwenya, was part of the ZAPU's founding national executive. So upon arriving in Lusaka, they established a working relationship with Kenneth Kaunda's government, and they were also given an opportunity to work with the Zambian broadcasting services. So this is how broadcasting started from Zambia into Southern Rhodesia. And broadcasting in English, in Shona, and in Ndebele, the message was very clear and straightforward. Sons and daughters of the soil, vana vevu in Shona language, abantwana benhlabathi in Ndebele, come and join the liberation struggle. So it was a clarion call, it was an invitation, it was a message that meant to incite revolt to the sons and daughters of the soil. So the term sons and daughters of the soil was used to identify the listeners or the imagined listeners, you might say. So the message was very clear, it was very elaborate, it was also very, very straightforward. And most guerrillas that were interviewed after independence in the 1990s affirmed that by listening to the guerrilla broadcasts that were coming into Southern Rhodesia, people left their schools, they left their workplaces, they left their homes under the cover of darkness to cross the Zambezi River and join their fellow comrades in Zambia. But obviously, these efforts by the guerrillas to influence or to win the hearts and minds of the people were not unchallenged. So we identified a number of ways in which the Rhodesian government tried to counter broadcasts that were coming from Zambia. And one of these aspects, Stephen has briefly talked about jamming. So the Southern Rhodesian government invested a lot of money in jamming, and they installed a very big transmitter close to the Zambian border, facing the Zambian side, and it was nicknamed the Big Beta transmitter. So it was introduced, it was installed in the 1970s specifically to jam radio signals that were coming into Rhodesia from Zambia and Botswana. Botswana was also a key player in this particular case. So the Big Beta transmitter was one of the many ways that the Southern Rhodesian government introduced to jam signals coming into Southern Rhodesia. And another way was also the introduction of what I conceptualize as an Askari radio station. Those that are familiar with South African history know the term Askari. So it was a radio station that broadcast in Ndebele, but in a way discouraging the liberation struggle. It was called Radio Mtwakazi, and it was introduced in the 1970s. So these are some of the methods that the Southern Rhodesian government tried to put in place to counter guerrilla broadcasts. Chapter 7 takes a biographical approach, and we put together the lived experiences of two guerrilla broadcasters. Jane Ngwenya, a female guerrilla, was broadcasting in Lusaka for ZAPU's Voice of the Revolution, and Nyasha Donald Musiwa was broadcasting for ZANU's Voice of Zimbabwe, based in Maputo, Mozambique. And in this chapter, we had the opportunity to compare and sort of contrast the differences in terms of approach and style of these two guerrilla broadcasting radio stations. And one of the major differences that we came up with is that ZAPU was particularly interested in having the key nationalist figures speaking directly to the listeners. It was quite an effective method, because imagine the listeners back at home listening to the voice of people like George Nyandoro, who were in the national executive, people like James Chikerema, people like Joshua Nkomo himself. Unlike the ZANU's Voice of Zimbabwe, where ordinary guerrillas were given the opportunity to control the airwaves. So on the ZANU side, there was a favor, there was a bias towards the intelligentsia. So the airwaves were mainly controlled by young guerrillas who had attained tertiary education. So I have here examples of people such as Sobusa Gulandebele, people such as Nyasha Donald Musiwa, people such as Webster Shamu, who was known as Charles Love. These are young guerrillas who had left the University College of Rhodesia in Nyasaland, and they were given the opportunity to control the airwaves in Maputo. So ZANU was primarily based towards the intelligentsia, and we also went to the extent of identifying the legacy of guerrilla broadcasting. We identified a number of individuals who later on assumed influential positions in government. So this is the legacy.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just asking you to wrap up, please, because we are getting close to the scheduled end of a meeting.
Sure, thank you. Just a minute. So we identified people such as Webster Shamu, who later on became Minister of Information and Publicity, also became a member of Parliament after the liberation struggle, and he's still a member of the ZANU-PF Politburo at the moment. The permanent secretary in the Ministry of Defense is also a former broadcaster. So the legacy of guerrilla broadcasting is still affecting, or is still shaping and influencing the processes of nation making in post-colonial Zimbabwe. So this chapter is particularly important because it goes beyond the liberation struggle to explore the extent to which guerrilla broadcasting cultures shaped and influenced the post-colonial state. Thank you so much for your attention, and Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thanks, Lloyd. I'm glad we got you back into the meeting. I'm just going to bring everyone on the screen here and, gosh, how do I do this? Sorry, I'm trying to multitask, but I'm not very good with the technology. Here we go. I think we've lost Ali again, but I'm glad that he was able to present his chapter. Can I please, I see there's a question from Kasonde in the chat, but if anyone else would like to put questions in the chat or raise their hands, please let me know so I can call you. We are sort of running out of time, but we can continue until about 20 past if there are questions and comments from the audience. Let me read Kasonde's comment for Lloyd in particular. He's asking, he's wondering if you found any similarities in the process of setting up colonial radio services for Black South Africans between Southern Rhodesia and the rest of the Central African Federation. I believe a saucepan radio was also promoted in Northern Rhodesia. There's another comment that's just come in from Cynthia. Stephen made a point that sonic presence was more important than winning hearts and minds. Could you elaborate on this? I think it's to both Sekiba and Lloyd. And I see Annie's hand is up. I'm gonna take Annie as well. If there are any other questions, please put them in now, because this might be the only chance to ask questions or raise issues. Please go ahead, Annie.
Hi everyone, thanks for very interesting presentations. I'm looking forward to reading the book. My question was about music. I'm interested to know what role music played on these radio stations. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I don't know if there's any other questions from the audience. Otherwise, I had a question around gender. It seems, you know, from the work that Lloyd and other colleagues have done on Jane Gwenya, that women played an important role as broadcasters. I was wondering if any of the programs targeted women were around mobilizing women in particular, and whether you have any sense of their audiences. Thanks very much. If there are no questions, I think Sekiba and Lloyd, I'll give it over to you. This is also an opportunity, obviously, to respond to the issues raised by Stephen.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to be brief because we don't really have time. I'm going to note some of the questions actually raised by Stephen. First of all, just a general comment, Stephen. I'm very pleased and heartened by the seriousness with which you took this book, and actually your comments were very positive about the book. We really appreciate that. Something like this, if it could come out as a kind of a review of this book, would be highly appreciated. So it's a proposition right there. I know maybe it's not my place to do that, but it's something that would really be great. You know, you question the whole title of the book, you know, Guerrilla Radios, as a sort of this notion of guerrilla as a recent neologism. Well, you know, yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating question. We thought about it long and hard. I mean, when we started this project, it didn't even start off as guerrilla radios. It simply started off as, you know, liberation war radios in Southern Africa. But ultimately, as editors, we ended up settling on this because we thought, no, I mean, guerrilla, what could be more attractive? What could be more sexy than guerrilla? You know, just for the purpose of, I think more than anything, I think I agree that perhaps this is too focused. I mean, the concept almost equates, it's like the armed struggle. But of course, these radios were about the armed struggle. They talked a lot about the armed struggle, but they talked a lot about other things as well. They covered a lot of other things, culture and so forth and so forth. But nevertheless, you know, we thought, well, you know, why not call it guerrilla radios in the end? The other one that I want to comment on very briefly is the paradox of the liberation movement's archives. The fact that we are all kind of trying, what we are doing with this volume is to sort of present a transnational histories of these radios. But then the kind of archives that we are using are almost forcing us to look at you know, the liberation movements through this national lens. I mean, that's a real difficulty that we found ourselves actually operating with. And through interviews, I mean, I'm kind of, some of us are already sort of looking at other projects beyond this edited volume, you know, interviewing people in the countries where, for example, the Radio Freedom was actually located, to ask questions about how, you know, radio broadcasters from Radio Freedom actually interacted with other radios as well. We are still exploring some of these questions because it's troubling us that in as much as we are trying to, you know, do transnational histories and actually see how these radios actually operate, you know, they are nonetheless kind of limited by their thinking along national lines. Interesting questions there by Annie. Well, if I could very, very quickly respond, music was an important aspect. You know, songs, especially of political songs that were often banned on public radio. You know, the Yuma Sikelas, you know, the Miriam Makebas, these songs would actually be played on radios, but also, you know, struggle songs. This is where they were actually played, and then those that actually listened to them would learn these songs, and then they would actually be coined in the streets and so forth and so. So music was very important. Even jazz, for example, listening to some of the programming of Radio Freedom, because one thing that Radio Freedom still has, or rather the archives are quite rich on the audio. The audio material is available actually at Maibuye Center, and you do find programs for example, the programs including jazz program, a jazz program that was actually broadcast on Sunday. I'll leave other questions for others to comment because we do not have time. Sorry to do that to you, Ariana.
Thanks very much, Sekiba. Lloyd, would you like to respond to Kasonde's question and any other points that have been raised?
Thank you so much, Ariana. Kasonde, that's a very interesting question you have raised. We have not gone to the extent of comparing the establishment of radio in Southern Rhodesia and Northern Rhodesia. What we did was to compare the context or the environment in which radio was established in Southern Rhodesia, comparing it to South Africa. And we found out that in Southern Rhodesia, there was no debate in parliament on the anticipated consequences of radio broadcasting among Africans. Unlike in South Africa, where there was a heated debate in parliament with parliamentarians.
Please, can't hear you.
View of consultation. So it's a very important question. Then Annie's question on music. music was really important, especially for ZANU's Voice of Zimbabwe. For example, news broadcasts started with guerrillas singing war songs. So it was part of the background music that was played whilst news broadcasts were being made. Political programs started with people singing in the background, and also the sound of a machine gun thundering in the background. And then also other conscientization programs had also background of drums beating in the background. So everything was accompanied by music of different sorts. So music came in different formats, in depending on a specific program that was being broadcasted at a specific moment. So music was part of broadcasting, but it came in different rhythms and also in different formats.
Thanks very much, Lloyd. There was a question in the chat from Motlame about the Bantustans and whether I suppose it would have been easier for Radio Freedom to be received within the Bantustans, but Zweledinga Jordan, who of course worked in the ANC's Department of Information and Publicity and for Radio Freedom, replied to that by saying that it was the Bantustans were all uniformly hostile to liberation movements, and it wasn't until Holomisa's coup in the Transkei that things turned. He's also partly answering to my questions around women. In Radio Freedom, ANC women leaders like Ruth Mompati, Gertrude Schope, and others regularly featured on programming, and there were broadcasts that deliberately targeted women. Thanks very much, Stephen. Is there anything else you would like to raise or say as way of conclusion? And I'll then hand it over to Sekiba for the very final remarks.
I'll defer to Sekiba.
Great.
Very much. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you for all the questions and all the comments that were made. I just wanted to perhaps very briefly respond to the question about the Bantustans. Yes, you know, Bantustan leaders were quite hostile to the liberation movements generally, but the Bantustans also provided some space for people on the ground to listen without the kind of fear that they would have actually had, for example, listening in Soweto and so forth. In fact, a number of interviews that I've conducted with people who lived, stayed in the countryside, who went to college, technical colleges, universities in the countryside, Tefluop, Polokwane, and so forth, some of whom have actually written autobiographies, do point out that there was space, and in fact, reception was much easier there. They didn't have the same kind of anxieties as they would have actually had being in the big cities like Joburg. So I think that question is a very good question, and there's potential here of even finding more how these spaces, the Bantustan spaces, were actually used to push back against the apartheid regime, even though there were spaces intended to reinforce apartheid. It's interesting that those were actually spaces that provided, there were spaces in those Bantustans for people to push back. Certainly, the issue of gender is very important, and of course, there were programs that specifically targeted women. But there were programs that actually, basically, in terms of their messaging, they were saying that women are not separate in this struggle. We are all fighting a common struggle. But nevertheless, I see someone has actually also commented and provided a very good response to say that, in fact, there's a whole list of women who were female broadcasters. on these radios. Balekambete is one of them, if I could just identify one. And in fact, one of the deficiencies in this book is the fact that we have not really been able to include more women. So the issue of gender is definitely very, very important. There were programs that were driven by women as well. There were programs that were specifically about women issues, reproductive health being one of them, but also programs that specifically said that, you know, the place of the woman is not in the kitchen, but in the struggle. And some of these programs were broadcast by women themselves. So I think, in a nutshell, this is a catalytic book, and we are hoping that out of this book, more books would actually come out. More interest would actually develop. There's certainly a lot. We have only scratched the surface here. There's certainly a lot in the archives. There's certainly a lot that the people who were involved as broadcasters, as listeners, are willing to talk about. There's definitely space. And on that note, I would like to thank everybody. This book is available, and I thought Corina would say something, but it's unlike the first edition that cost more than 1,000 Rand. This book only costs 420 Rand. So it's fairly reasonable. So please go out there and purchase the book. Certainly would like to see this book used in the classroom, in the lectures, in the undergraduate and postgraduate seminars. Would certainly like to see this book established there. We got a lot of support when we worked on this book. I don't want to waste too much time, reading the list of people who really assisted. First of all, let me acknowledge the two universities specifically that hosted us, Wits and Pedagogic University in Maputo. Most notably, I'd like to acknowledge Professor Mucha Musema, the head of the School of Social Sciences. I think we have come to the end. I'm not sure, have we come to the end? Or people are still there? Yes. So Mucha actually opened the very first official opening of the project in February of 2017. The workshop itself, he was there. The history workshop has been very, very helpful. Noor gave his unstinting endorsement of the project from its conceptual stage and accepted our request that it be administered within the history workshop. And most importantly, Noor gave very insightful comments throughout the 2 days of the first workshop at Wits. Now, both the Johannesburg workshop and the Maputo workshops wouldn't have happened without the sterling work of Antoinette Rose, the senior administrator for both the SACHI Chair Program in Local Histories and Present Realities and the History Workshop, who dealt with the financial aspects of and logistics of organizing, from the booking of accommodation, flights and shuttles through to catering arrangements. Now, on the Mozambican side, of course, our appreciation goes out to the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Philosophical Sciences, Professor Bento Rupia, the Director of International Relations Offices, Professor Sarita Monjani Henriksen, and the Director of the Central Library, Dr. Isa Isaac, for making it possible for the workshop to be accommodated at the university, Pedagogic University that is. And lastly, Monica Siba did a fantastic job as a copy editor in terms of trying to make the different chapters to read like one integrated book. Obviously, these are different chapters. We are all over the show. We focus on different things and making different arguments, but certainly in terms of trying to really bring this book to sound as one integrated whole, we believe that Monica actually did a fantastic job. And lastly, of course, we have to appreciate you, Stephen, once again, for doing a great job as the discussant for this book. And Ariana also for chairing. Despite the technical challenges that we have experienced, we are really glad that this is actually happening. The only thing that we don't have, of course, is the bubbly. And we hope that hopefully in the near future, the country would open up and would have a proper, a proper book launch where we can, gather and have some wine and have something to eat and have a good time. And actually maybe even have someone selling the books there. We are challenged because of the times that we find ourselves in, but hopefully we'll be in a situation in the near future where we can actually have proper book launches. But we appreciate that we have had some kind of a launch. And thank you very much, everyone. We really appreciate the questions and the comments that were made tonight. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Sekiba, and thank you to all the speakers for the very interesting presentations and the discussion. Thanks to the audience for your comments in the chat and for participating in the launch. And as Sekiba said, let's hope that the next one may be in person, where we can actually socialize afterwards. But I hope you all have a glass of wine to celebrate with. It may be a bit early for Stephen in the US, but for the rest of you, enjoy your evening. And thanks very much. And thanks to Corina for organizing this launch. Thank you.
Yes, indeed.
Goodbye, everybody. There's some more comments. Congratulations from various people, Sekiba. I hope you're reading the messages. Oh, last thing, the meeting was recorded, so I will upload the recording on the History Workshops YouTube channel in the next few days. Please bear with me, but we'll put it up there. I'll share the link on our social media, and I'll share it with you, the speakers, in case you need it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Congratulations again. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you.